The sound came before the sight of it, a low mechanical growl that did not belong to the morning, rising underneath the brass and the bells until it swallowed them whole. I was 11 strides from Aldous Renmark when it happened, close enough to see the exact instant the ordinary hardened into the unforgettable. He did not shout. He did not run in the way frightened men run, all elbows and noise. He simply moved, and to this day, when the old guardsmen at Harrowgate speak of what he did on the forecourt steps of the Kingsmere Gate, they lower their voices, because some things you do not say loudly. You lay them down gently, the way you lay a wreath. My name is Corwin Ashby, and I was a second-year guardsman of the household watch on the morning a rogue vehicle came for the Crown Prince. I have told this account 3 times to men who wear more braid than I ever will, and each time I have left something out, because the truth of it is too large to fit in a report. I will not leave anything out here. I owe him that. Let me begin where it should be begun, not with the vehicle, but with the man who stood between it and the boy who will one day be king. Aldous Renmark had served the royal house of Harrowgate for 19 years by the spring I am describing. He was not a young man's idea of a hero. He was lean and gray at the temples, with a face that had learned long ago how to hold still, and hands that never quite unclenched even off duty, as though they were always half a second from being needed. The younger watchmen called him the post behind his back, because they said you could set a clock by where he stood and how long he stood there. It was not an insult. It was the highest thing we knew how to say about a man in that uniform, and we said it the way boys say things they mean but are too proud to mean out loud. I had been assigned to the Kingsmere Gate detail under his eye that season, which meant I spent my mornings learning to be still and failing at it. The Kingsmere Gate is the eastern face of the palace, the one the public sees, a long gilded railing above a broad stone forecourt, and beyond it the sweep of the processional road, where the motor cars come and go and where, on ceremonial mornings, the crowds press 3 deep against the barriers to watch the household ride out. That morning was such a morning. The Crown Prince Rowan was to lead the spring review, a modest thing by the standards of the house, but the first public duty he had been given entirely to himself, without his father the king beside him. He was young for it. The whole palace knew it, and half the palace whispered about it, and I confess I had my own opinion, which I kept to myself as a junior man ought. The prince came down the forecourt steps at 10 minutes past 9, and I remember thinking he looked like a portrait that had learned to walk. He had his late mother's coloring. The house still spoke of Queen Isolde in hushed tones, 5 years gone and not a day of her forgotten, and he had a way of carrying his shoulders that was almost too correct, as though he were afraid that if he relaxed even slightly, the whole weight of what he was would come loose and scatter. He was flanked by 2 mounted guardsmen and an equerry, and the crowd along the processional road lifted a cheer that rolled up the stone like surf. Renmark stood at the base of the steps, at the point where the forecourt narrowed toward the gate and the waiting motorcade. It was his post. He had stood it 1,000 mornings. His rifle was at his shoulder, his gloves were white, his eyes were forward, and if you had photographed him at that moment, you would have had a picture of a man made entirely of discipline, with nothing human showing anywhere. I have thought a great deal in the years since, about what was showing that we could not see. Because Renmark had noticed something. I did not know it then. I learned it later in the quiet rooms where such things are pieced together, and I will tell it in its place. But even at the time, in the corner of my attention, I registered that his eyes, which never moved, had moved. Just once. Toward the far end of the processional road, where a service lane fed onto the public route, and where a heavy gray utility vehicle had been idling for longer than any parked vehicle idles. The prince reached the base of the steps. The crowd's cheer swelled. Somewhere a band began the opening bars of the review march, all brass and certainty, and the gray vehicle's engine changed its note. I heard it before I understood it. A growl, then a rising howl, then the crunch and shriek of a barrier being shoved aside as the thing lurched out of the service lane and onto the open road, gathering speed with every yard. Aimed, there is no gentler word for it, aimed directly at the narrow point where the Crown Prince of the realm now stood alone at the foot of his mother's palace. Everything after that happened in the space of perhaps 4 seconds. I have stretched those 4 seconds across 19 years of retelling, and I still cannot make them last long enough to hold everything that was inside them. The crowd screamed. The mounted men's horses reared. The equerry, a decent man but a clerk in a fine coat, froze with his hand half raised. The 2 mounted guardsmen were good soldiers, but they were 8 and 10 yards off and turned the wrong way, and a horse cannot pivot and charge in the time a falling stone takes to fall. Renmark was the closest man to the prince. He was perhaps 5 strides off, at an angle, with the width of the forecourt and his own rifle, and every rule of his service telling him to hold his ground and let the trained men in the road handle the road. He broke every one of those rules in the same instant. He did not raise his rifle. A rifle was useless. A shot fired into a moving vehicle on a crowded forecourt does nothing but add a second catastrophe to the first. He did not shout a warning. There was no time for the prince to hear it, understand it, and act. There was only time for one thing, and it was the one thing that no rule of his service permitted, and no reasonable man would have chosen. And it is the thing they mean when they say, in those lowered voices, that Aldous Renmark did the unthinkable. He dropped his rifle. 19 years of discipline, and he let his weapon fall clattering to the stone as though it were nothing, because his hands were needed for something else. And then he crossed the 5 strides in a way I will never forget, not a run, but a kind of controlled fall forward, every ounce of him committed, and he took the Crown Prince of Harrowgate around the chest and shoulders and drove him bodily sideways, off the narrow point, out of the line, into the shelter of the stone balustrade at the edge of the steps. He put the prince behind the stone, and he put himself in front of it. There was no time to get himself clear after, he knew that. I have wondered in my darker hours whether he calculated it, whether in that quarter-second his mind ran the geometry and understood that saving the boy meant not saving himself, or whether he simply moved, the way the truly disciplined move, so that the man is gone and only the duty remains. I think it was the second thing. I think by the time the calculation would have arrived, the deed was already done, because he had spent 19 years teaching his body to obey the duty faster than the fear. The gray vehicle struck the corner of the stone balustrade where the prince had been standing 1 second before. The impact was enormous. Stone that had stood for 2 centuries burst apart. The vehicle's front end crumpled and it slewed and spun, and came to a shuddering, smoking halt half up the forecourt steps, its horn now jammed and screaming one long, unbroken note across the sudden, terrible silence. And Aldous Renmark lay on the stone at the edge of it all, very still. I will not describe his injuries in the way the medical men described them, because he would not have wanted his hurt made into a spectacle, and because a boy who reads this over some future shoulder does not need those pictures. I will say only this. The corner of the balustrade that broke had broken against him, that he had shielded the prince with the whole of himself and taken into his own body a portion of what the stone gave up, and that when I reached him, I was the first. I had been 11 strides off and I closed them without any memory of moving. His eyes were open and clear, and the first thing he did was not to cry out. The first thing he did was look past me at the balustrade and ask, in a voice that was steadier than it had any right to be, "The prince, is he standing?" I looked. Behind the stone, white-faced and shaking and entirely, miraculously unhurt, Crown Prince Rowan was standing. "He's standing," I said. "He's standing, Renmark, you did it. He's standing." Something eased in the older man's face then. Not a smile. He was past smiling, but a loosening, as though a hand that had been clenched for 19 years had finally been given permission to open. "Good," he said. "Then it doesn't matter." I have carried those 4 words for the rest of my life. Then it doesn't matter. As though his own body, broken on the stone, were a cost he had already agreed to pay a long time ago, and the only accounting that concerned him was whether the payment had bought the thing it was meant to buy. He had not fainted. He would not let himself. He lay there and he breathed carefully, and he watched the prince with a kind of fierce attention, as though the boy might yet be taken from him if he looked away. And he did not let go of that watching until the medical men had bundled the prince inside the gate and behind 100 locked doors, and there was nothing left in the world that could reach the child he had bought back from it. Only then did he close his eyes. The horn was still screaming. The crowd was a wall of noise. Guardsmen were pouring out of the palace now, too late to have mattered, forming their cordons and shouting their orders and doing all the things that men do after the moment that required them has already passed. Somewhere in the gray vehicle a door had come open, and there was movement inside it. And there would be, in the hours to come, a great many urgent questions about who had been behind that wheel and why. But I was not thinking about the driver. I was kneeling on cold stone with my hand pressed to the shoulder of a man who had just done the bravest thing I had ever seen a human being do, and I was thinking about his 4 words, and I was beginning, only beginning, to understand that the story of that morning did not end when the vehicle stopped. It was only starting. They took Renmark to the palace infirmary rather than a public hospital, on the direct order of the king, which is a thing the house does only for its own. The prince was taken to the private apartments and put under a guard so thick you could not have slid a letter through it. And the gray vehicle, and the man they pulled from behind its wheel, were taken to a place I did not have the rank to know about, which is exactly as it should have been. I was kept on the forecourt for 6 more hours, giving my account, giving it again, watching men in plain coats measure the distance from the service lane to the broken balustrade with tapes and chalk and long grave silences. I learned very little that day, but I learned one thing from the mouth of the plainclothes officer who questioned me, and it turned the whole morning over in my hands like a stone with something written on the underside. "You say the vehicle came from the service lane," he said. "The eastern service lane, the one that feeds the processional road." "Yes, sir." "That lane," he said, "was supposed to be barriered this morning, closed to all traffic for the review. The order went out 3 days ago. Every service lane along the route was to be sealed and manned." He looked at me with eyes that had stopped being tired and started being something colder. Every lane was sealed and manned, except that one. The barrier on that one had been logged as placed. It was not placed. And the man logged as manning it had been reassigned, at short notice, the evening before, by a written order that no one will admit to having written. I remember the cold that went through me then, standing in the spring sunlight on the warm stone. "You mean," I said, and could not finish it. "I mean," the officer said, "that we do not yet know whether this morning was a runaway machine or a murderer's arithmetic. But I know that a barrier does not fail to be where an order says it is, and a guard does not vanish from his post without a hand behind it. And I mean to find the hand." He walked away across the forecourt, and I stood there a long time, and above me the broken corner of the balustrade showed its raw new stone against the old, like a wound that had not yet learned it was a wound. I did not know it yet, but the fight to find that hand would be longer and stranger and closer to the throne than any of us on the forecourt that morning could have imagined. And the man who would refuse, more stubbornly than anyone, to let it be written off as an accident, the man who would go on asking the dangerous question long after wiser men had stopped, was lying broken in the palace infirmary, watching the door, waiting to be well enough to stand back up. I was permitted to see him on the 3rd day. The infirmary of the royal house is nothing like the wards of the city hospitals. It is a long, high room with tall windows and old oak, more like a chapel than a place of medicine, and the house keeps it staffed by physicians who have signed away their whole lives to discretion. Renmark had been given the corner bed, nearest the window, where a man could see the sky. His right arm was bound across his chest. His shoulder and several ribs had taken the worst of the stone, and there was a dressing above his brow that he clearly resented, because he kept forgetting it was there, and reaching up to adjust his non-existent bearskin with a hand that could not lift that far. He was awake, and he was furious, and he was hiding the fury under a discipline so total that a lesser observer would have called him calm. "Ashby," he said, when the physician let me in, "sit, tell me what they will not tell me." I sat. "They're keeping you in the dark on purpose," I said. "The physician says you're not to be agitated." "I am agitated by being kept in the dark," he said, with the ghost of dry humor. "So the cure is worse than the disease. What do they know about the vehicle?" I hesitated, because I was a junior man and there were things I was not certain I ought to say, and Renmark saw the hesitation and, being who he was, disarmed it directly. "Corwin," he said, my given name, which he almost never used. "I put my body between a 2-ton machine and the heir to this house. If I have earned anything, I have earned the truth about why it was there. Now, what do they know?" So I told him. I told him about the service lane that was supposed to be barriered and was not, about the barrier logged as placed and never placed, about the guard reassigned the evening before by an order that no one would own. I watched his face while I spoke, and his face did what it always did, nothing at all on the surface, but his eyes moved the way they had moved on the forecourt, tracking something the rest of us could not yet see. "The driver," he said when I had finished. "Who is he?" "A groundsman," I said. "One of the estate men, Halloran, from the Eastern Gardens, 12 years in service. No debts anyone can find, no grievance anyone can name. He says the vehicle's accelerator jammed and the brakes failed together and he could not stop it, and he was as terrified as anyone. And the mechanics who have torn the thing apart say," I stopped. "Say what?" "They say he might be telling the truth," I admitted. "The accelerator linkage was fouled and the brake line was cut through, both, on the same vehicle, on the same morning." Something happened in Renmark's face then that I had never seen before and would not see again for a long time. It was not fear and it was not anger. It was a kind of terrible attention, the attention of a man who has just understood that the ground he is standing on is thinner than he thought. "A jammed accelerator," he said slowly, "is an accident. A cut brake line is a crime. A jammed accelerator asterisk and a cut brake line on the same machine sent down the one lane out of a dozen that someone forgot to seal. At the one moment the Crown Prince stood alone at the foot of the steps, he stopped. That is not an accident, Ashby. That is a design, and a design has a designer." "The officer thinks so too," I said. "He's looking for the hand behind the order that moved the guard." "He won't find it in a written order," Renmark said. "Whoever did this was careful enough to cut a brake line and clever enough to make it look like a fool's bad luck. They will not have signed their name to the reassignment. There will be a scapegoat waiting at the end of that trail, some clerk who transcribed the order, some junior officer who passed it along, someone with just enough guilt to be blamed and not enough knowledge to be dangerous. The house will want an answer. It always wants an answer. And the danger is that it will accept the first one that lets everyone sleep." I did not fully understand him then. I understand him now. He knew the heart of the house, that a great household under threat wants a resolution more than a truth, a name it can punish, a door it can close. The most dangerous moment in such a case is not the beginning, when all are afraid, but the middle, when all are tired and a plausible villain is offered up on a plate. "Then what do we do?" I asked, and I heard myself say we asterisk and did not take it back. Renmark looked at me for a long moment. Then he looked at the door and past it, toward the wing of the palace where the Crown Prince was kept behind his 100 locks. "You are going to do exactly what your duty tells you," he said. "You are going to give your account, plainly and completely, to whoever asks it, and you are going to leave the finding of the hand to the men whose office it is. That is the correct thing, and I will not have you doing otherwise. And you." The dry humor came back into his eyes, but underneath it was something like iron. He said, "I'm going to lie in this bed and heal as fast as this body will let me, and I am going to think. Thinking is not against protocol, and when I am back on my feet I am going to stand where I always stand, and I am going to watch, because whoever built this design failed. The prince is alive, and a designer whose design has failed does not simply pack up and go home." His voice dropped. "He builds another one." The words settled over the quiet infirmary like a cold front. "You think they'll try again?" I said. "I think," said Aldous Renmark, "that a man who is willing to crush the Crown Prince with a stolen groundskeeper's vehicle and blame it on bad luck is a man who wants something so badly he will risk everything for it. And a man like that does not stop wanting because the first attempt broke a balustrade instead of a boy. I think he is, at this moment, somewhere inside these walls, being sorry not that he tried, but that he failed. And I think the only reason he has not tried again already is that the house is watching too closely just now for him to move." He shifted against the pillows, and I saw the pain of it cross his face and vanish. "That will not last. The watching always eases. Grief and fear burn hot and burn out, and then people want to feel safe again. And wanting to feel safe is how you stop actually being safe. When that day comes, when the guard is thinnest and the house has decided it can breathe, that is when he will move, and I intend to be standing where I can see it." I left the infirmary that afternoon with my mind full of shadows. I had come in thinking of Renmark as a wounded hero to be pitied and admired. I left understanding he was something else, that the same unbendable thing that had put him in front of a moving vehicle was now fixed on a quieter and far more dangerous target, and would not let go until it was finished. I did not yet know how close to the throne it would lead. But he knew the shape of it already, the way an old soldier knows a storm by the smell of the air, and he had made up his mind to walk into it. The palace in the days after wore two faces. On the outer face, all was mourning turned to relief, and relief turned to celebration. The Crown Prince had been saved. The house had held. The story that reached the public, and it reached them fast, because a crowd of hundreds had watched it and filmed it on their phones, was a story of miraculous deliverance and heroic sacrifice. A grainy image of Renmark's controlled fall forward, of the instant he took the prince behind the stone, appeared on every screen in the realm within the hour, and by nightfall the whole country knew the name of the guardsman who had done the unthinkable. Flowers began to pile at the Kingsmere gate. Children left drawings. An old veteran in a worn regimental blazer stood at the barrier every morning for a week and saluted the broken balustrade until his arm shook. King Alaric himself came to the infirmary on the fourth day, a thing so far outside the ordinary that the physicians nearly fainted. He was a big man gone quiet with age, the king, with a grief in him that had never fully healed since Queen Isolde died, and I am told he stood a long time at the foot of Renmark's bed before he could speak. "They tell me," the king said at last, "that you dropped your rifle." "I did, your majesty," Renmark said. "I beg the house's pardon for it. A weapon abandoned is a serious fault." The king looked at him. And then the king, this I had from the physician who was in the room, the king put his own hand over the guardsman's bound and broken one, very gently, and said, "A weapon is a thing that takes life. You had no use in that moment for a thing that takes life. You had use only for these." And he pressed softly the ruined hand. "Do not ever beg my pardon again for the finest thing a man has done under my roof in 20 years. That was the outer face of the palace. Gratitude, relief, a nation moved. But there was an inner face, and I began to see it only because I had made myself Renmark's eyes and legs while he could not use his own. And so I went where a junior guardsman would not normally go, and heard things a junior guardsman would not normally hear. The inner face was afraid. And underneath the fear, in the deep private rooms where the real business of a great house is done. The inner face was busy in a way that had nothing to do with catching a murderer and everything to do with deciding what kind of truth the house could afford to own. I must here speak carefully about the queen consort. Her name was Morwenna, and she had married King Alaric 2 years after Queen Isolde died, a marriage the older courtiers had never quite forgiven, though none of them would say so where it could be heard. She had come to the house from a lesser noble line, ambitious and clever and beautiful in a hard, polished way, and she had brought with her 2 grown children of her own from an earlier marriage. Lord Cassius, a young man with his mother's ambition and none of her patience, and Lady Verena, who watched everything and said little. I set down what I observed. I do not accuse. The accusing is not mine to do, and I have seen too many good men ruined by rumor to add my voice to any. But I owe the truth of what I saw, and what I saw was this: that in the days after the forecourt, while the whole house trembled with fear for the Crown Prince and grief for his guardsmen, the queen consort Morwenna was not afraid. She was calm. She was, if anything, more composed than she had been in months. And on the second day, when the succession was quietly discussed in the way such things are discussed, for a near miss with the heir sets every mind in a great house running down the corridors of what might have been, it was noted by more than one person that had the Crown Prince died on those steps, the path to the throne would have run, after King Alaric, through a much shorter and less certain line, and that shorter line bent, at a certain point, unmistakably toward the interests of the queen consort's own children. Rowan stood between Morwenna's ambitions and a great deal. Alive, he was the future of the house. Gone, he was a door thrown open. I did not want to think it. I want the reader to know that. I had no love for the queen consort. Few of the old household did, but suspecting a murder is a heavy thing to lay on any soul, and I resisted it. It was Renmark, from his infirmary bed, who taught me not to look away from a thing merely because it was terrible to look at. "You are uncomfortable," he observed on the 5th day when I had come with my report and left out the part my instincts had gathered. "You are leaving something out because it frightens you. Don't. Fear is a fine servant and a ruinous master. Say the thing." So I said the thing. I told him what I had noticed about the queen consort's calm, about the succession, about the door thrown open. And Renmark listened with his eyes closed, and when I had finished he was quiet for a long time. "You understand," he said at last, "that I served Queen Isolde, that I stood at her door when the Crown Prince was a small boy, and she used to bring him down to the guardroom in the mornings, before the house was awake, because he liked the horses and she liked to see him happy. I am not a man who can pretend to no feeling in this. So hear me when I say what I am about to say, because I say it against my own heart, not with it." He opened his eyes. "We must suspect no one and rule out no one. Not the queen consort, and not the groundskeeper, and not the clerk who will be offered as a scapegoat, and not any noble lord whose ambitions this serves. The moment we decide we know who did this, we stop seeing what actually happened. A designer this careful will have built his design to point at exactly the person our fear wants to blame, because a false answer that everyone believes is safer for him than no answer at all. If we are led by our hatred, we will be led exactly where he wants us to go." It was the wisest and hardest thing anyone said to me in that whole affair, and I have tried to live by it since. Suspect everyone. Convict no one until the thing is proven. Let the evidence and not the appetite decide. But even as he said it, I saw in his face that he had a fear of his own, the fear that the house would not have his patience, that the house wanted its answer and wanted it soon, and that an answer was already being prepared. He was right, it was. The scapegoat's name was Denby. He was a junior clerk of the household office, a nervous, decent, unremarkable man of perhaps 40, and his crime was that his initials appeared at the bottom of the reassignment order, the order that had moved the guard from the Eastern Service Lane the evening before the review. He had transcribed it. He said, and I believe he said it truly, that he had transcribed it from a verbal instruction relayed to him by a senior aide whose name he had been told not to record, and that he had thought nothing of it, because clerks transcribe 100 such orders a week, and it is not their place to question the source. But the senior aide, when questioned, denied ever relaying such an instruction. And so the trail, which had promised to lead upward toward whoever wanted that lane open, dead-ended instead at a frightened clerk with his initials on a page and no one to corroborate his story. The house, I saw, was relieved. Here was an answer it could hold. A negligent clerk, a fatal clerical error, a barrier that failed to be placed because a lazy or careless man had botched an order, tragedy, yes, and gross dereliction, yes, but comprehensible asterisk. Not a murderer in the walls, not a knife at the throat of the succession, just a small stupid mistake by a small forgettable man, of the kind that great institutions can absorb and punish and move past. Denby was suspended, an inquiry was convened, and the word that began to travel the corridors, traveling downward from somewhere high, the way such words do, was that the matter was essentially settled. A runaway vehicle, a mechanical failure, a lane left open by clerical negligence, a groundskeeper who could not stop what he was driving, a terrible chain of accidents and errors. No hand behind it, no design, no designer, a relief. I brought this news to the infirmary on the 8th day, and I have never seen Renmark closer to open anger. A brake line does not cut itself, he said, and his quiet voice had an edge in it that could have drawn blood. Have a groundskeeper who says the brakes failed and the mechanics who confirm the line was cut, and they are going to write it down as mechanical failure and hope the words do the work of the truth. They have a lane that was left open by an order no one will own, and they have hung it on a clerk who transcribed what he was told, and they are going to call it asterisk negligence and close the file. Ashby, he pushed himself up in the bed, and I moved to stop him, and he waved me off. Listen to me. Every seam in this design is a lie stitched to look like an accident, a cut brake line called a failure, a murderer's order called a clerk's mistake. The whole thing is being tailored, right now, into a garment the house can wear without shame. And when it is finished, the man who built it will walk free inside these walls, and he will wait, and he will build the next one, and the next one will not fail. He sank back against the pillows, spent, and for a moment the pain he never showed came fully into his face, and I saw how much the effort had cost him. Then he closed his eyes and was still, gathering himself the way he gathered himself before a long watch. "Renmark," I said quietly, "what do you want me to do?" He did not open his eyes. "I want you to find me one thing," he said. "Not the whole design, just one loose thread the tailor missed. Every design has one. Careful men are careful about the things they think of, and no man thinks of everything." He was quiet a moment. "The groundskeeper, Halloran. He drove the vehicle. If the design was to end with the prince dead, then Halloran was meant to die too. A runaway crash at that speed does not spare the driver. Which means either Halloran was part of it and expected to die, which I do not believe, because a man who expects to die drives differently than a man fighting to stop, or Halloran was not meant to be behind that wheel at all." I stared at him. "What do you mean?" "I mean," said Renmark, "that Halloran keeps saying the same thing, and everyone keeps hearing it as an excuse, and no one is hearing it as a fact. He keeps saying the vehicle was not his to drive that morning, that he had been sent to move it, told to move it from the far yard to the eastern shed, a short errand, 100 yards, nothing. That the accelerator jammed the instant he touched it, and the brakes were gone when he reached for them, and by the time he understood what was happening, the machine had already carried him out of the yard and down the lane and onto the road. He was not driving an attack. He was a man trapped inside a moving trap that had been set for whoever was told to move that vehicle that morning." Renmark's eyes opened. "Find out who told him to move it. Find out who gave Halloran that errand. Because that is the hand, Ashby, not the clerk who wrote the order about the barrier. The person who put a specific man behind a specific wheel at a specific minute." That is the one who knew everything. I went out from the infirmary that evening with a single question burning in me, and it was the right question, and it changed everything. I want to be honest about my own smallness in this. I was a second-year guardsman. I had no authority to question anyone, no office, no standing. What I had was a uniform, a reputation by association with the most admired man in the realm that week, and a great many corridors I was permitted to walk. So I did the only thing a man in my position could do. I listened, and I asked small questions of small people, the kind of people the great investigation walked straight past. I found Halloran's foreman, a weathered old man named Price who ran the Eastern Grounds crew and who had known Halloran for a decade, and was sick with guilt that one of his men had been at the wheel of the thing that nearly killed the prince. Price talked to me because I was young and low and not one of the frightening men in plain coats, and because he needed to talk to someone. He never should have been near that vehicle, Price told me, in the potting shed where his crew took their tea. The gray utility, that's not a grounds vehicle. That's a works vehicle, belongs to the estate maintenance office, different chain of command entirely. My men have no cause to touch it. But that morning young Halloran comes to me white as a sheet and says he's been told to shift it to the eastern shed, told direct, and could he be excused his rounds to do it? Told by whom? I asked, and I heard my own voice come out too eager and made it flat. Price frowned. That's the thing I keep turning over. He said it come down through the works office. A note, a written chit, the sort that authorizes a man to take a vehicle. He showed it me, I remember, because it was odd, us being grounds and not works, and it had a works office stamp on it and a signature I didn't know, and it said Halloran was to move the gray utility from the far yard to the eastern shed at 9 that morning. 9 sharp. It even said the time. 9 sharp. The Crown Prince had come down the steps at 10 minutes past 9. 100-yard errand begun at 9, down the lane that fed the processional road, in a vehicle rigged to run away and not stop. Time to arrive at the mouth of that road at precisely the minute the heir stood alone at the foot of the palace. I felt the cold again, the deep cold, the cold of understanding. That chit, I said, the written order, where is it now? Price's face fell. Gone. The plaincoat men took it first day, along with everything else. Evidence. He shook his head. Wish I'd made a copy, but who copies a chit? It was just a chit. Do you remember the signature? No, he admitted. It weren't a name I knew. Initials more than a name, the way senior men sign. Couldn't tell you what they were. He looked at me with his tired old eyes. But I'll tell you what I can tell you, young sir, and it's this. Whoever wrote that chit didn't want to move a vehicle. Vehicles get moved by a word. You don't put a written works office order and a stamped time on a 100-yard shift unless you want a record that says a asterisk groundsman, not a worksman, chose to take that vehicle out at that minute. Unless you want, when it all goes wrong, for the trail to end at poor Halloran and go no further. It weren't an order to move a vehicle. It were an order to choose the man who'd be blamed. I have met clever men in fine coats who understood less than that old gardener understood over his tea. I thanked him, and I nearly ran back to the infirmary, and I told Renmark everything, and I watched the last piece of his patience harden into something colder and more certain than patience. So, he said softly when I had finished, there is the loose thread, a chit from the works office with a stamp and a signature and a time that put an innocent groundskeeper behind a rigged wheel and pointed the whole blame at him when it was done. The clerk Denby is the second scapegoat, dressed up for the barrier. Halloran is the first, dressed up for the wheel. 2 innocent men tailored to take the fall so that no one would look higher. That is not the work of a runaway machine, Ashby. That is the work of a mind that thinks 3 moves ahead and does not care who it feeds to the fire. He looked at me. And it is the work of someone with access to the works office and its stamp. Someone who could have a written chit produced on official paper and a signature that a foreman wouldn't recognize but a stamp would legitimize. Someone inside these walls, high enough to command that quietly and cold enough to time a boy's death to the minute. The name neither of us said hung in the air between us like the note of the jammed horn, one long, unbroken sound. Renmark returned to his post on the 17th day, against the advice of every physician in the house. He should not have. His shoulder was far from healed, his ribs still bound, and he could not yet lift his right arm to the height his rifle required. But he presented himself at the guardroom in the gray of dawn, in full uniform, standing as straight as pain would let him stand, and when the watch sergeant tried to send him back to bed, he said, quietly and immovably, "My post is where I am useful. I am no longer useful in a bed. I am aware of the state of my body, Sergeant. I am more aware of the state of the house. I will stand." And he stood. They gave him a station inside the gate rather than on the open forecourt, a concession he accepted because it placed him, as it happened, on the very corridor the Crown Prince used, and Renmark had already decided that where the prince walked was where he intended to be. He could not have arranged it better if he had drawn the map himself, and I have sometimes wondered whether the watch sergeant, who was an old friend of his, understood exactly what he was doing and gave him the station on purpose. The old household looks after its own in ways the paperwork never shows. I was assigned as his relief and second, which meant we shared the corridor watch, and which meant that for the first time I stood a long duty beside the man rather than merely bringing him reports. I learned more about him in those silent hours than in all the weeks before. I learned that he prayed, very privately, at the turning of each hour, not moving his lips, just a stillness inside the stillness. I learned that he watched the Crown Prince not as a guard watches a charge, but as a man watches something he has personally purchased at great cost and does not intend to lose to carelessness. And I learned that he was, beneath the iron, deeply and quietly afraid, not for himself. He had used up his fear for himself long ago, but that he would fail the boy a second time, and that the second time there would be no balustrade to break instead of a body. The Crown Prince, for his part, had changed. He was a subdued young man in those weeks, and who would not be, having stood 1 second and 1 stride from his own death and watched a stranger take it in his place. He came down the corridor each morning more slowly than he had before, and each morning he stopped at Renmark's station, a thing no protocol required and most princes would never have thought to do, and he said, "Good morning, Renmark," and waited for the guardsman's grave, correct reply, and only then went on. It was a small ritual. It meant a great deal. On the 4th such morning, the prince stopped longer and dismissed his equerry down the corridor out of earshot, and stood a moment before the older man in an awkward silence that I, at my own station, a discreet distance off, pretended not to witness. "I have not properly thanked you," the prince said at last. "There is no proper way. I have tried to think of one and there isn't. Everything I can think to say is too small." "Your Highness owes me no thanks," Renmark said. "It was my duty and my honor. I would ask nothing more of my life than to have done it." "You dropped your rifle," the prince said, for that detail had caught the whole realm's imagination, the guardsman who threw away his weapon to use his hands. "They say it was the bravest thing. Was it hard to let it fall?" And Renmark, who almost never volunteered anything of himself, was quiet a moment, and then said something I have never forgotten. "No, your Highness, it was the easiest thing I have ever done. A rifle is for an enemy you can strike. There was no enemy I could strike in that moment, only a boy I could save. The hard things in this service are the ones where duty and feeling pull against each other. That was not one of them. In that one moment, for once, they pulled the same way." He paused. "Your mother, the late queen, used to bring you to the guardroom when you were very small. You liked the horses. She used to say she trusted the household with you more than she trusted the whole court, because a courtier serves the crown but a guardsman serves the person wearing it. I have never forgotten that she said it. I dropped my rifle because she was right." The Crown Prince stood very still, and I saw from my distant station that his eyes had filled. He had been a boy of 6 when his mother died. He remembered her, I think, mostly as an absence. To be handed, out of nowhere, this small living fragment of her. She used to bring you to the guardroom. She used to say asterisk was a gift beyond any thanks he could have devised. "Thank you," he said, in a different voice than before. "That thank you." And he went on down the corridor, and he was, I think, a slightly less lonely young man than he had been before he stopped. I record this not merely because it moved me, though it did, but because it matters to what came after. From that morning, the bond between the guardsman and the Crown Prince was a real thing, seen by the whole house, and there were those in the house to whom a bond between the wronged heir and the one man determined to prove the wrong was a very unwelcome development indeed. The false dawn came in the 4th week, and it came, as false dawns do, dressed as good news. The inquiry into the forecourt affair delivered its findings. I will summarize them as they were summarized to the House. That the incident had been caused by a catastrophic mechanical failure of the gray utility vehicle. That the vehicle had been in the process of a routine relocation authorized by the works office. That the driver Halloran was blameless, and had in fact acted with courage in attempting to control an uncontrollable machine. That the Eastern Service lane had regrettably been left unsecured owing to an administrative error in the reassignment of its assigned guard, and that the clerk Denby, while negligent in his transcription, had acted without malice and would be reprimanded rather than dismissed. The mechanical failure here was the sentence that made Renmark's jaw set like stone when I read it to him. The mechanical failure was consistent with wear and improper maintenance, and no evidence of deliberate interference had been established to the standard required. No evidence of deliberate interference. A cut-break line, and they had found a way to say those words. The house exhaled. You could feel it. The nightmare had been given a shape it could live with. Bad luck, bad maintenance, an unlucky lane, and the shape did not contain a murderer, and so the house chose to believe it because believing it meant everyone could sleep. The extra guards began quietly to be stood down. The 100 locks around the Crown Prince began quietly to be loosened. The plaincoat men packed their tapes and their files and went back to whatever plaincoat men do when there is nothing to investigate. And the flowers at the Kingsmere gate, which had been a mountain, began to wither and be swept away. It was exactly what Renmark had foreseen. The watching was easing. The house had decided it could breathe. "Now," he said to me, on the gray morning we read the findings, and there was no triumph in it, only a terrible steadiness. "Now he will move. He has his verdict. The world believes it was an accident. The guard is thinning by the day. He has been made patient by his own cleverness. He built himself a story the house would swallow, and the house has swallowed it. And now he need only wait for the corridors to empty and try again. And when the prince dies the second time, it will be called a second accident, or a grief-maddened suicide, or a sudden illness, and the story will already be written that says the house has no enemies within its walls." He looked down the empty corridor toward the prince's apartments. "He thinks he has all the time in the world now. That is his mistake. Because there is one guard who did not stand down and did not stop watching and did not believe the verdict, and he is standing on this corridor." The loose thread, once Renmark had hold of it, did not let go. He could not investigate openly. He had no office and no warrant, and the inquiry was closed, and a wounded guardsman who went about the palace asking pointed questions about a case the house had officially settled would very quickly find himself retired to a pension and a cottage far from anything that mattered. So he did it the way the disciplined do everything, quietly, patiently, within the letter of what a guardsman may lawfully do, using nothing but his eyes and his memory and his long knowledge of the house and the loyalty of men who owed him. The works office kept its records. A guardsman may not demand them, but a guardsman on his lawful rounds passes the works office a dozen times a day, and a clerk who remembers being defended by that same guardsman years ago, when a superior tried to break him unjustly, may, entirely of his own free will, leave a particular ledger open on a particular desk when a particular man happens to be standing his post nearby. I will not name that clerk. He took a risk for the truth and he deserves to keep his quiet. But through him, over the course of 3 careful weeks, Renmark learned the shape of the thing. The chit that had sent Halloran to the grey vehicle had indeed borne the Works Office stamp. But the Works Office stamp, it emerged, had been signed out of its locked drawer on the evening before the review signed out, according to the ledger, by an aide acting on behalf of a member of the household above the Works Office's own authority. The ledger did not give the member's name. It gave a household seal, and the seal was one that only a handful of people in the whole palace were entitled to use. One of those people was Lord Cassius, the Queen Consort's son. Renmark did not leap on it. That was the discipline of him. Where a lesser man would have run to the king crying murder, Renmark understood that a household seal in a ledger is not a confession, that seals can be misused, that a clever designer might well have contrived to make his design point at exactly the ambitious young stepson everyone would be quickest to suspect, precisely as Renmark had warned me weeks before. If it points at Cassius, he said, then either Cassius did it, or someone wanted Cassius to hang for it, or someone wanted us to waste our fury on Cassius while the real hand stayed hidden. All 3 are possible. I will not choose among them out of appetite. I will watch and I will wait for the one who moves, because the guilty one is the one who will act again, and when he acts, he will show me his face. So he watched, and in the watching he began to notice the second design taking shape, the way you notice the tide by the wet line creeping up the sand. It began with the Crown Prince's diary, his schedule of duties, which was kept and circulated among a small number of household offices. Renmark, standing his corridor watch, saw the prince's movements each day and remembered them as a guardsman remembers such things, and he began to notice small alterations creeping into the schedule that reached the outer offices. A visit moved. An escort reduced. A route changed to one that passed, on a certain forthcoming afternoon, through the old eastern courtyard, a place of high blind walls and a single gated arch, overlooked by the disused upper windows of the estate maintenance wing. A place, Renmark said quietly when he showed me on a plan of the palace, where a man at an upper window would have a clear line down onto anyone crossing below, and where a single gated arch could be shut to trap whoever was inside. The forecourt was a machine, he said, loud, public, deniable as bad luck. This will not be a machine. He has learned that a machine is clumsy and leaves cut-break lines that clever men can find even if they choose not to. This time it will be quieter, a fall from a height that is called an accident, a collapse that is called a sudden illness, something that leaves no cut line to explain away. He traced the eastern courtyard with one gloved finger. And it will happen here. On the afternoon the prince is scheduled to cross this yard alone, because someone has been arranging for weeks that he shall cross it alone. When? I asked. 11 days, he said. The schedule has him crossing the eastern courtyard 11 days from now, to attend the unveiling of his mother's memorial garden. A private occasion, few guards, the prince's own wish that it be quiet and personal, which means the designer knows the prince's heart, knows he will want to be alone at his mother's memorial, knows he will resist a heavy escort there of all places. The design uses the boy's grief for his mother as the door to reach him. Something moved in Renmark's jaw. Whoever this is understands that the prince loved his mother and has built a trap out of that love. That is the coldest thing I have encountered in 19 years of service, and it tells me something more. What? That the hand is close to the prince, close enough to know how he grieves. This is not a hired assassin working from a diagram. This is someone who has watched that boy mourn and has decided to use the mourning as a weapon. Only a very small number of people in this house stand close enough to know the shape of the Crown Prince's grief. He was silent a moment. And most of them loved his mother too. Most of them, not all. I went in those 11 days, further than a junior guardsman should go, and I did it because Renmark could not, because the eyes of the house were on him now, the famous guardsman, and where he went was noticed. And so the quiet work fell to me, who was noticed by no one. I learned that the alterations to the prince's schedule had entered the record through the household office, and could not be traced to any single hand. The same fog that had swallowed the barrier order swallowed this too. I learned that the disused upper windows of the estate maintenance wing, which overlooked the eastern courtyard, had been unlocked and aired within the last fortnight, logged as inspection ahead of refurbishment, by a works order bearing, again, a household seal that only a handful could use. I learned that Lord Cassius had been, of late, much occupied with the estate maintenance office, on business he described as the modernization of the palace's fabric, a project the Queen Consort had championed at court, and which gave her son and his people the run of exactly those wings and windows and work stores where a design might quietly be built. And I learned one thing more, and it was the thing that turned my suspicion into something colder and surer. I learned it from a maid who cleaned the Queen Consort's apartments and who, like the works clerk, talked to me because I was young and low, and she needed to talk to someone. She told me that some weeks before the forecourt, she had overheard the Queen Consort and her son in a low quarrel behind a not-quite-closed door, and that she had caught only fragments, and that the fragments had frightened her so badly she had told no one until now. She had heard Lord Cassius say in a hard, low voice, if the boy were simply gone, none of this would signify. And she had heard the Queen Consort answer, not in horror, not in refusal, but in a cool and level and terrible calm. Then see that whatever is done cannot be laid at this door. I will not have clumsiness. I will not have a hand that can be traced to me. Not do not do this, not how can you speak so, only see that it cannot be traced to me. I brought that to Renmark, and I watched the last shred of doubt go out of him. Not the discipline never went, but the openness to other answers, the asterisk suspect everyone that he had held so rigorously for so long. It did not collapse into fury. It hardened into resolve. It is not proof, he said. A maid's half-heard words, a seal that many could misuse, a schedule that changed in a fog. In a court of law it is nothing. If I take this to the king as it stands, the Queen Consort will call it the ravings of a wounded guardsman jealous of his standing, and Cassius will produce a dozen lords to swear he was elsewhere, and I will be pensioned off within the week, and the prince will cross that courtyard in 10 days with no one watching who knows what watches back. He set his jaw. So I will not take it to the king as it stands. I will take him the one thing no lord can swear away and no consort can call ravings. I will take him the designer, caught in the act of the design, with the whole house to witness it. I will let them build their trap, and I will be inside it, waiting when it closes. It was the boldest and most dangerous thing I have ever known a man to attempt, and I told him so. You mean to let the Crown Prince walk into a trap you know is set, I said, and stop it only at the last instant. If you are wrong about any part of it, the day, the place, the manner, the prince dies, and you die with him for having let him walk in, and the whole realm curses your name. I know exactly what I mean to do, Renmark said, and I know exactly what it costs if I am wrong, which is why I will not be the only safeguard, and why the prince will not truly be alone, though every eye will believe he is. He looked at me steadily. I have learned, Corwin, that a man who tries to carry the whole weight of a thing alone is a proud man, and pride has killed more good soldiers than fear ever did. I did not save the prince on the forecourt because I was strong. I saved him because I was close, and because I moved before I thought. This is different. This needs more than one man moving. It needs the house itself to move, but the house will not move on a maid's whisper. So I must give the house a reason it cannot deny. And I must have, at my back, one person of the blood who will believe me before the proof, and act the instant it arrives. Who? Princess Adela, said Renmark. The king's sister. I confess the name surprised me, though it should not have. Princess Adela was the one member of the royal family whom the queen consort had never charmed and never cowed. A formidable, plain-spoken woman of 60 who had loved Queen Isolde like her own sister, and had made no secret in the years since of her distrust of the marriage that replaced her. She had no love for Morwenna and no fear of her, and she had, crucially, the standing to act. A word from Princess Adela could summon guards, hold doors, command the household in the king's name. She was the one door in the whole palace the designer could not have accounted for, because she was the one person the designer's careful web of fog and seals and scapegoats could not touch. Too high to blame, too shrewd to fool, too fond of the dead queen's son to be turned aside. "She will not believe a guardsman on his word alone," I said. "No," Renmark agreed, "but she will believe her own eyes. And she will believe the schedule which I can show her, and the aired windows which I can show her, and the eastern courtyard, which she can walk herself and see for the trap it is. I do not need her to convict anyone. I need her to stand ready out of sight, with men she trusts, on the afternoon the prince crosses that yard, and to move when I give the signal, and not 1 moment before, so that whoever comes to that window comes all the way, and is taken in the act, before the whole weight of the house, where no seal and no lord and no cool denial can unmake what a dozen honest men have seen with their own eyes." He went to her. I do not know all that passed between them. I was not admitted, but I know that Aldous Renmark, a common guardsman, was granted a private audience with Princess Adela of the House of Harrowgate that lasted the better part of 2 hours, and that he came out of it grim and steady, and that from that day Princess Adela's manner in the presence of the queen consort acquired a new and watchful stillness that Morwenna, for all her cleverness, seems never quite to have read. The plan was laid. The prince would keep his schedule, all unknowing, for Renmark had decided after long and painful deliberation that the boy must not be told. "If he knows," Renmark said, "he will not be able to hide it. He is brave, but he is young, and a young man who knows he walks into a trap walks differently, and the designer is watching how he walks. The prince's safety lies in his innocence being real. He must cross that yard as a grieving son, because that is what he is, and because only if the trap believes it is working will the trap fully spring." He was quiet. I do not like deceiving him. He trusts me, but I would rather deceive him and save him than be honest and bury him. That is the arithmetic of this service, and I made my peace with it long ago. So the prince was not told. And in the days that remained, the two designs ran side by side beneath the surface of the palace. The murderer's design, tightening its net around the eastern courtyard, all seals and altered schedules and aired windows. And the guardsman's design, quieter still, a single trusted princess and a handful of honest men and one wounded guard who did not sleep, waiting to close a net of their own around whoever came to that upper window with murder in his hands. The afternoon came gray and still. I remember every hour of it. Renmark had positioned his pieces with the care of a man who knew the price of a mistake. Princess Adela was lodged, with 6 guardsmen of the old household, hand-picked, loyal to the bone, told only that the Crown Prince's life might depend on their absolute stillness and obedience, in a shuttered gallery above the eastern courtyard, opposite the maintenance wing, with a clear view across to the disused upper windows and down onto the yard below. I was placed at the single-gated arch, in the shadow of it, in the plain coat of a groundsman rather than a guardsman's uniform, so that whoever watched the yard would see no soldier there, only, if they saw me at all, an estate hand about his work. And Renmark himself was in the maintenance wing. That was the part of the plan that frightened me most. He had reasoned that the killer would come to the upper windows overlooking the yard, and that the surest way to take him in the act was to be already inside the wing, waiting, close enough to reach him before he could do his work. So Renmark, whose shoulder was still not sound, whose ribs still ached, who could not yet raise his right arm to the height of his old rifle, had gone alone into the maintenance wing before dawn and concealed himself in the dark of its corridors, to wait, for a whole day, for a murderer to climb the stairs. "If I am wrong," he had said to me the night before, "and the design is somewhere else, then I have wasted a day and made a fool of myself, and I will bear it. But if I am right, the killer comes to that wing, and there must be a man already inside it who can stop him, and that man cannot be Adela's soldiers, because 6 men crossing that yard would be seen, and the design would simply not spring. It must be one man already in place, invisible. It must be me." And that had been the end of the argument, because there was no answering it. The whole plan turned on one wounded guardsman, alone in the dark of an empty wing, backed only by a princess and 6 men across a courtyard who could not move until he gave the sign. At 3:30, the Crown Prince entered the eastern courtyard. He came as Renmark had said he would come, alone but for a single equerry, on foot in a dark coat, carrying a small wreath of white flowers for his mother's memorial which lay beyond the far arch of the yard. He walked slowly. His head was bowed. He was entirely and truly a grieving son on his way to lay flowers for his mother, and he had no idea in the world that above him, behind the aired glass of a disused upper window, death was drawing back to strike. I saw it before Renmark could have. From my place in the shadow of the arch, looking up and across, I saw a movement at the upper window of the maintenance wing, the dark shape of a man, easing the aired window fully open, leaning out into the gray air with something long and heavy braced across the sill. Not a rifle. I understood in a rush of cold exactly what Renmark had foreseen. Not a shot, which would echo and be heard and be investigated, but a fall. A loosened section of the old stone parapet that ran along the wing's roofline above the window, pried free over weeks of quiet refurbishment, poised now on the sill, ready to be tipped the short deadly distance down onto the head of a young man crossing the yard below at a moment, and a place chosen for him weeks in advance. A stone from a crumbling old palace, fallen by tragic accident onto a grieving prince. No cut-break line, no echoing shot, no evidence of deliberate interference to the standard required. The Crown Prince walked, unknowing, toward the exact spot beneath the window where the stone would fall. And the shape at the window braced itself to push. I have relived the seconds that followed more times than I can count, and they never lose their terror, because for one endless instant I believed we had failed. Believed that Renmark, alone in the dark of the wing, had not reached the right room in time, that the whole careful design of the honest men had come down to a groundsman in a false coat frozen at an arch, too far to do anything but watch the stone fall. I opened my mouth to shout, to warn the prince, to break the plan, to do the only useless thing left to a man too far away, and I did not have to. Because the shape at the window jerked backward, violently, as though the air itself had seized it, and the long, heavy section of parapet balanced on the sill tipped, but not down, not out onto the yard. It tipped asterisk inward back into the room, crashing to the floor inside the wing, where it could crush no one. Renmark had reached the room. Renmark had come out of the dark of the corridor at the last possible instant, and seized the killer from behind, and hauled him bodily back from the window, and turned the falling stone from a weapon into so much broken masonry on an empty floor. And then, across the courtyard and up through the aired window, I heard the struggle. It was brief. It was not the clean, silent thing you might imagine. Renmark was a wounded man, his shoulder half-healed, his ribs bound, his right arm not yet strong, and the killer was younger and whole and desperate. And for a few seconds the two of them fought at the open window in a way that made my heart stop, because I could see from below that if the killer broke free he might still tip the stone, or worse, take the guardsman out of that window in his place. I could not reach them. No one could reach them in time. The whole thing balanced, for those few seconds, on whether one wounded man could hold one whole one. He had held a 2-ton machine off a boy with his body. He held one desperate man off a windowsill with the last of a broken arm and the whole of his will. And when I heard him call out one word, loud and clear and carrying across the gray courtyard, the signal we had agreed upon, now, I saw the shuttered gallery opposite fly open and Princess Adela's 6 guardsmen pour out and across the yard toward the wing at a dead run, and I came out of the shadow of the arch and ran with them. And above us at the window the struggle ended, because 6 honest men and a stubborn wounded one are more than any single desperate murderer can outfight. The Crown Prince had stopped in the middle of the yard, staring up, utterly bewildered, a grieving son who had walked into a memorial garden and found the whole house erupting around him. Princess Adela was suddenly there beside him, her hand firm on his arm, drawing him back from beneath the window with a strength that brooked no argument, and I heard her say, in that plain iron voice of hers, "Stand back, Rowan. Stand back and let them work. You are not to move from my side until I tell you." And the prince, who had never in his life been spoken to so, obeyed her without a word, because there are moments when even a prince knows the ground has shifted, and the only wisdom is to do as the steady old woman says. They brought the killer down the stairs of the maintenance wing and out into the gray light of the courtyard, held fast between 2 guardsmen, and the whole design was made flesh at last, and I saw the face of the man who had tried twice to murder the Crown Prince of Harrowgate. It was not Lord Cassius. I record my own shock honestly. I had been so sure the seal, the maid's words, the modernization project that gave him the run of the wing. I had convicted him in my heart a dozen times, exactly as Renmark had warned me not to. But the man they brought down those stairs was not the queen consort's ambitious son. He was a lean, graying, unremarkable man in the plain dark clothes of a senior household servant, a face everyone in the house knew and none, I think, had ever once suspected. He was the queen consort's chamberlain, her most trusted man, the keeper of her seals. His name was Vale, and he had served Morwenna for 20 years, since before she came to the house, the one servant she had brought with her, wholly and only hers. He held her household seal because it was his office to hold it. He knew the Crown Prince's schedule because it was his office to know the movements of the house. He had the run of the works office and the maintenance wing because his mistress's modernization project gave her whole household that access. And he moved beneath everyone's notice because a chamberlain is furniture, is background, is the man who is always there and never seen. He had built both designs, the machine and the stone, the forecourt and the courtyard. He had chosen Halloran and he had chosen Denby, and he had built each trap to point the blame away from the throne he served, and he had done it all so quietly that the whole house had looked straight through him for weeks. And he had done it. This was the thing that came out later, and it turned my blood cold to hear it. Not on any explicit written order, not on any word that could ever be traced to his mistress, but on nothing more than the cool level sentence a maid had overheard through a not quite closed door. See that whatever is done cannot be laid at this door. I will not have a hand that can be traced to me. She had never told him to kill the prince. She had told him to see that if the prince were gone, no hand could be traced to her. And Vale, who understood his mistress better than she understood herself, who had served her ambition for 20 years and made it his own, had heard in those words exactly the instruction they were meant to be, and had gone away and built 2 murders that could never be laid at her door. Because the whole genius of his design was that there was no order, no chit in her hand, no seal she could not disown. Nothing between her cool sentence and 2 dead scapegoats, but the loyalty of one invisible man who would carry the whole guilt alone and never speak her name. That was the coldest thing of all, not the machine, not the stone. The fact that the deadliest weapon in the whole affair had been a wish spoken aloud to a man loyal enough to turn it into a plan and take the fall for it in silence. He did not speak at first in the courtyard. He stood held between the 2 guardsmen and looked at Renmark, at the wounded guard who had come out of the dark and undone 20 years of careful invisible service in the space of a gray afternoon. And there was in his face not fear, but a kind of bitter professional astonishment, the look of a craftsman who cannot understand how his flawless work has failed. "How," he said at last, very low, "did you know?" And Aldous Renmark, breathing hard, his half-healed arm hanging useless at his side, his uniform torn from the struggle, looked back at the man who had twice tried to kill the boy he had bought back from a moving vehicle with his own body, and gave him the only answer he ever gave. "Because a brake line does not cut itself," he said. "You built your whole design to be believed by men who wanted to believe it. You never accounted for one who didn't. What followed, I will tell more briefly, because the terror of it was over, and what remained was the long, slow work of justice, which does not make for the same kind of telling but matters just as much." Vale was taken. He said nothing further in the courtyard, and little in the days after, but he did not need to speak, because the design he had built to be invisible became, once a single honest man had pulled its first thread, entirely visible. The parapet section on the floor of the maintenance wing, pried loose over weeks and poised on a windowsill above the exact spot the prince had been scheduled to cross, that alone was a thing no cool denial could explain. The aired windows, logged under a seal he held. The altered schedule traced now, with the inquiry reopened, and the plaincoat men returned in force and Princess Adela standing over their shoulders, back through the fog to the same seal. And the gray vehicle's cut brake line, which the first inquiry had been so eager to call a failure, examined again by men who now knew a murderer had been in the walls, and named at last for what it was. Two designs, both his. The evidence, once it was allowed to be seen, was overwhelming. Vale, in the end, when he understood that the whole edifice was down, and that there was no story left that could save him, made his confession. A long, cold, precise confession, delivered without remorse and without excuse, the confession of a craftsman explaining his work. He confessed to the vehicle and to the parapet, to the choosing of Halloran and the framing of Denby, to the whole of it. He confessed to everything he had done with his own hands. He did not confess a single word against his mistress. To the very end he held to the shape of his design. There was no order, there was no instruction, there was nothing between the queen consort and the murders but his own devotion. He alone was guilty. He had acted, he said, out of a loyalty that had curdled over 20 years into a monstrous thing. A servant so wholly given to his mistress's advancement that he had come to serve her wishes before she wished them, and had built 2 murders to smooth a path she had never explicitly asked him to smooth. He took the whole weight onto himself and would not let it touch her, and there was in that, I think, the last terrible proof of exactly the thing that damned her, for no man builds such devotion in a vacuum, and no mistress is served so fatally by chance. King Alaric heard it all. He aged in those days before the eyes of the house, to learn that his own wife's most trusted servant had twice tried to murder his son, and to hear the servant swear, too smoothly, that his wife had known nothing, was a wound no crown can armor a man against. He was not a fool, King Alaric. He understood exactly what such a confession was worth and what it was designed to protect, that the loyalty which will build a murder is the same loyalty which will take the fall for one. But understanding is not proof, and a king cannot condemn a queen on the shape of a servant's silence. So he did the thing that was within his power, and it was more than I had expected, and it told the whole house where his heart stood, even where his justice could not reach. Vale was condemned, stripped, tried, and sent away for the remainder of his life to a fortress from which no man returns, which is as near to the old ultimate penalty as the house of Harrowgate now goes. Halloran was cleared entirely, restored to his post, and given a pension and the king's own thanks for the courage he had shown fighting a machine no man could have stopped. The clerk Denby was reinstated, his record wiped clean, with an apology from the household office that few clerks in the history of the house have ever received. The 2 innocent men who had been tailored to take the fall were lifted back up and made whole, And I think that mattered to Renmark almost as much as the saving of the prince, because Renmark could not bear to see a small man crushed to protect a great one, and had said so more than once. And the queen consort Morwenna, against whom nothing could be proven, whom no confession would name, who sat through the whole affair in a cool and perfect composure that never once cracked, the queen consort found that though the law could not touch her, her husband could. King Alaric did not accuse her. He was too careful and too much a king to make an accusation he could not prove. But in the weeks that followed, quietly and without a word of explanation, the queen consort's household was reduced. Her modernization project was cancelled. Her people were reassigned, one by one, to lesser posts far from anything that mattered. Her access to the wings and the works and the seals was withdrawn. And the crown prince, this the king did openly before the whole court, was formally placed for his protection, under the personal guardianship of Princess Adela and the senior household, his schedule sealed, his safety put beyond the reach of any hand in the palace, however high. It was never said aloud whose hand the king was guarding his son against. It did not need to be said. The whole house watched the queen consort's power drain quietly away, and no one, not even she, pretended not to know why. She kept her crown. She kept her title. She kept her cool, perfect composure to the end of her days, but she never again held anything in the house of Harrowgate but the empty forms of it, and the son of Queen Isolde grew up safe and strong under the eyes of those who had loved his mother, and became, in the fullness of time, exactly the king that the guardsman on the forecourt steps had bought back from the moving vehicle, so that the realm might one day have him. I have only the ending left to tell, and it is the part I most wanted to set down, because the world remembers the forecourt, and the world remembers the courtyard, but almost no one remembers what happened between a young prince and an old guardsman on a quiet morning after it was all over, and it is the truest thing in this whole account. Renmark's shoulder never fully healed. The second struggle, at the window, undid much of the first mending, and he was told plainly by the physicians that he would not again have the full use of his right arm, and that his days of standing a rifle post were over. For a man who had defined himself for 19 years by the perfection of that post, it was a kind of small death, and he bore it the way he bore everything, without a word of complaint, though I who stood beside him saw what it cost. He was offered a pension and an honorable release. He was offered by the king himself any reward within the house's power to give. And Aldous Renmark, who had twice saved the heir to the realm and asked for nothing, asked at last for one thing, and it was the smallest thing, and it undid me to hear it. He asked to be allowed to keep a post, not a rifle post, he could not stand one, but any post at all, a door, a corridor, a quiet station where a one-armed old guardsman might still be of use. I have no life outside the walls, he told the king simply. I have served the house since I was a young man. I do not know how to be anything but a guardsman. Let me be a guardsman still, in whatever small way a broken one can. That is the only reward I want. The king gave it to him, but the king and the crown prince gave him more than he asked, because the great are sometimes generous in exactly the way that matters. They gave him the guardroom. The old guardroom by the eastern stables, the same guardroom where, long ago, a young Queen Isolde had brought her small son down in the gray mornings to see the horses, because she trusted the household with him more than she trusted the whole court. It had fallen into disuse over the years. The crown prince had it restored, and appointed Renmark its keeper, master of the young guardsmen who trained there. And it became, under the old one-armed guard, the place where every new man of the household learned what the uniform meant, learned it not from a book but from the living presence of the man who had done the unthinkable and would tell them, if they asked, that it had been the easiest thing he ever did. I know because I was there the first morning the crown prince came down to that restored guardroom, in the gray before the house was awake, exactly as his mother had once brought him. He was not a small boy any longer. He was a young man who would be king. but he came the same way, quietly, before the world was watching, and he stood in the doorway of the guardroom where his mother had trusted the household with his life, and he looked at the old guardsman who had made good on that trust twice over, and he did not say anything grand. He said, "Good morning, Renmark." And Renmark, who could no longer raise his right arm to salute, and who did not try, rose from his chair by the guardroom fire and stood as straight as his broken body would let him stand, and answered, in the same grave and correct and unbroken voice I had heard on the forecourt steps the morning the whole thing began. "Good morning, your highness. The house is quiet, all is well." And it was. For the first time in a long time in the house of Harrowgate, all was well. I have kept my promise. I have left nothing out. If you have read this far, you know now what the old guardsmen mean when they lower their voices and say that Aldous Renmark did the unthinkable. And you know that the truest unthinkable thing was not the 4 seconds on the forecourt when he dropped his rifle and put his body before a moving vehicle, extraordinary as that was. The truest unthinkable thing was everything after. The wounded man who would not let a lie be written, who suspected everyone and convicted no one, who lifted up 2 small crushed men and would not let them be sacrificed, who caught a murderer no one else could see, and who asked, at the end of it all, for nothing but the chance to keep standing his post. That is the man I served. That is the man who taught me what the uniform is for. And when my own time comes to lower my voice and hand this down to some young second-year guardsman who thinks the highest thing you can say of a man is that you could set a clock by where he stands, I will tell him that there is a higher thing. You can set your life by where he stands, and he will still be there.